To start? Okay, yep. I can hear myself now. Well, it's hard to believe, but we're wrapping up the book of 1 Samuel today. Next week, the plan is, I believe, for Mike to do an overview of, or a review, I should say, of the book of 1 Samuel. But today, we'll actually be wrapping up by looking at chapters 28 and 31. So if you remember last week, Mike kind of explained some of like these last 4 chapters, you've kind of got like 2 chapters kind of dedicated to David's perspective or view, and then chapter 28 and 31 that we look at today is kind of looking at it a bit from Saul's perspective. But, to kind of start things off today, there's something about us humans that we love to be scared, right? Or, spooky stories or haunted houses or whatever it is. And even, at this point, Halloween, which we have in our culture, we have basically a whole day or, holidays set aside around, spooky, scary things. That is now, from what I understand, that's now the second most decorated holiday of all the holidays. So only obviously behind Christmas. So, but there's something about being scared that there's some appeal in some way to us as humans. And I think part of that, if you talk to psychologists, is that, being scared releases like endorphins and adrenaline. And when your brain, I guess, subconsciously knows that, whatever you're experiencing isn't really going to harm you, that there's kind of this dopamine, adrenaline rush that you get from being scared. And I grew up on the east coast of Florida, and we would going to Disney World is something that we did, it seems like multiple times a year. I lost count a long time ago how many times that had been. But I remember when I was young, I think Kelly might make fun of me for this, but when I was young, this is the Haunted Mansion at Disney World. This was a scary ride for me, right? Now, this is one of the most, to me now, this is probably one of my favorites at Disney World, but it's an iconic ride, right? But when I was young, that ride was scary to me. Maybe that wasn't for you. But I started going to Disney World when I was fairly young. So, maybe that's my excuse. But there were things in there that were scary with ghosts that would kind of pop up and make this noise, and it's all dark inside, right? It's good fun, but it would scare me as a kid. There was this one scene, though, that to me is just very memorable when you go into the Haunted Mansion. And I think it's actually a very well done scene. But it's this scene with, and I just learned her name this week, Madame Leota. I didn't know that she had a name. But there's this part of the Haunted Mansion that when you're going through on the ride and you're riding in your little, the little buggy car, which is actually named Doom Buggy, D-O-O-M. Leave it to Disney to be clever with about everything they do. But you go through this one room, and the buggy that you're in, it kind of goes around the outside perimeter of the room, but it always turns and faces this, Madame Leota, where there's this, disembodied head within this crystal ball. And it's the Imagineers that did this, to me, did a great job of the visual effect here. But as you go around that room, she's in that crystal ball and she's going through all of these incantations, right? And calling out to the spirits to make noise. And as you're going through this and you're riding through it, there'll be noises behind you, spirits are making some noise. She'll call the spirit to make some type of noise to let them know they're present. And it was always kind of spooky to me as a kid, right? It was kind of scary. But what's amazing to me is what we're reading about today, as you can probably guess, what I'm going to talk about, the medium of Endor, or the witch of Endor, sometimes it's called. We've actually got in Scripture an event, based upon what I would almost loosely call a seance. And to me, it's just a terrifying thing. Seances, to me, as a kid, right, that was always just like, no way. I would want nothing to do with that. It was terrifying to be able to actually think that somebody was communicating with the dead. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 23, and we're going to start at verse 3, and we're going to be talking about the medium or the witch of Endor. So it starts out with this verse. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him at Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. So the author here, obviously guided by the Spirit, is reminding us that Samuel has died. I don't know, do you think we really need reminding of that? I don't know. I think there's a point that the author is making here. This reminder that Samuel had died. And we're going to see that in a minute. Now, it says that Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. And if you look up the definition of a medium and a necromancer, so a medium would be someone who claims to be able to communicate with spirits of the deceased. In necromancy, the supposed practice of communicating with the dead, especially in order to predict the future. Now, we're told that Samuel had put them out of the land. And in this case, whatever his motivations were, Saul was doing the right thing, right? By putting them out of the land. And why is that? Well, let's kind of review some of the scriptures that we have in the law around spiritualism. So in Exodus 22:18, it says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." Leviticus 20:27, "A man or a woman who is a medium or a necromancer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones. Their blood shall be upon them." Again in Leviticus 19:31, "Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out, and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord God." And finally, again in Leviticus, "If a person's turned to medium or necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people." So we can see that obviously spiritualism was condemned under the law. Therefore, Saul, removing the necromancers and the mediums out of the land, he was actually doing as what God would have wanted, not questioning his motives. So continuing on, verse 4. "The Philistines had assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, by Urim, or by the prophets." So as Mike, he talked about this last week, and again, it was kind of a little bit more from David's perspective, but there's this big battle, right? This climatic battle that's brewing here at the end of 1 Samuel. We've got the Philistines coming against Israel. At this point, we're seeing this from Saul's perspective. Remember, David was actually living with the Philistines at this time, had gone down and was living in a city kind of in the southern part of Philistia. was going to go into battle with the Philistines, but because a lot of the Philistine lords didn't trust David, they thought that he would maybe turn on them during battle. They said, no, you can't do that. So he was sent back to where he was down in the lower part of Philistia. Right? But a lot of what we have here going on now is in that northern area of Israel. So Saul says to his servants, seek out a woman who is a medium that I may go and inquire of her. And his servant says to him, behold, there is a medium at Endor. So God isn't answering Saul. Saul is greatly distressed at this point because he sees the Philistines now arrayed against him in battle. He's afraid. He's been calling out to God. God has been silent and hasn't answered him. So what does a good and upstanding person do? Well, of course, what do? Well, let's turn to spiritualism and see what I can find out. So he asks if there's a medium, right? And his servants are like, well, okay, yeah, there still is. So it does kind of beg the question, maybe, when it said that they had removed the medium and the necromancers out of the land, maybe they hadn't done that great of a job because obviously the servants were immediately aware of one that was in Endor. These maps just don't always come across very well on the screen. It's going to be hard to see this maybe. But this is really a map that I think does a pretty good job of representing what we're going to be talking about today, both with chapter 28 and in 31. And I don't know how well you can see this, but all right, so this is up here. I believe this is the very bottom of the Sea of Galilee. So most of all the story that we've been talking about so far in 1 Samuel has been really below where this map cuts off. So this is kind of moved up to the northern part of Israel. And I think, as I understand it, probably one reason for that is that you can kind of see, looking at this map, you can kind of see the topography down here, right? And if you can see that, I don't know how well you can see that, but when they show you kind of the relief of the land, you can see it's fairly hilly down here, okay? But you'll notice up here, you've got the Jezreel Valley, this plain, so it's very level. Now, my understanding is that the Philistines relied on chariots, and as you can imagine, if you're trying to run chariots through hilly country, it's probably not going to work out that well. So you're kind of at a disadvantage if you're fighting against the Israelites in that lower part of Israel, in that hilly area. So maybe it made sense for them to go up and think, hey, let's go up to the Jezreel Valley where it's flat. We can leverage our advantage using our chariots. So the Philistines have made camp here around the Shunem area, and I believe the Israelites are down here somewhere right around Jezreel. Right? And you can see here on the map, it's listed out as Endor. Now, one of the things to me you might notice there is that, and I hadn't thought about this until I studied the lesson this week, but if the Israelites were down here, to get up to Endor, where the medium was at, they had to go fairly close to where the Philistines were located and encamped. So it seems to me like it's a bit of a risk to have to move up around that area. And also, just show real quick on the map, Mount Gilboa, my understanding is, because when I looked this up, it's really a ridge line. So more than just a specific peak or mountain there in this area, it really is referring to kind of this ridge line that you see here that's on the edge of the Jezreel Valley. Okay, so continuing on, verse 8. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. That kind of maybe makes sense. When you think about, well, why was Saul disguising himself? Well, I guess there's a couple reasons. He could have known that, I think he obviously did know that what he was doing was wrong. He knew that God forbid going to visit mediums and necromancers, obviously, because he had put them out of the land earlier. So Saul knows what he's doing is wrong. He's in such a desperate state at this point because God's not listening to him or answering him that he's willing to just do whatever. So maybe he was putting on these garments to disguise himself because he didn't want the people to know that, hey, wait a minute, this is Saul. This is the guy that threw out the necromancers and the mediums out of Israel, and now he's going to visit. So, was it a disguise in order to not have the people of Israel question his what he was doing? Possibly. It's also very likely to me, though, when we looked at that map and how he was going to have to potentially kind of skirt around where the Philistines were at to get up to Endor, maybe it was a disguise to try to hide himself from the Philistines and not get discovered by the Philistines in case they encountered any along the way. Not sure. So he goes to the woman by night, and he says, "Divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." The woman says, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Now, to me, this woman, this medium, is obviously savvy, right? She probably did not survive as long as she had being a medium in Israel, without being a little suspect maybe of people coming to her, right? So I think she naturally is perceiving that, okay, wait a minute. I got to be sure about this. This seems like a trap. So she questions Saul about that. Now, as far as we know, she does not know that this is Saul at this point, right? I don't know if she has any suspicion or not, but she's worried, right? Verse 10, Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." So Saul gives her reassurances, it's going to be okay. Apparently she takes him at his word. So again, I don't know if she suspected Saul, that this was Saul, and maybe decided, well, okay, if this is Saul and he's given me his word by the Lord, swearing by the Lord, I guess he means what he says. So she asked, "Who do you want me to bring up?" And he says, "Bring up Samuel for me." And to me, these few verses just seem to I'm sure there's a lot going on here, right? But this is all that's recorded in the scripture. And I think, man, there's got to be a little bit more going on potentially. It just seems to kind of just go from ding, 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 just one thing right after the other. Like, all right, who do you want? Saul, Samuel? Yep, okay. So Saul says, "Bring up Samuel." Now I got to think, what is she thinking at this point? I don't know what kind of clientele usually would go visit her, but I think, at least based upon things we see today in our culture, where they have TV shows about famous mediums. I remember there was one years ago that a woman had a TV show where she supposedly could speak to the dead on behalf of people. I would suspect that most people would actually go to have a loved one, hear from a loved one, maybe get some comfort from a loved one that's passed. But here's Saul saying, "Bring up Samuel," one of the greatest leaders in the history of Israel. And I got to wonder to myself, is she thinking, wow, this guy's, go big or go home, I guess. He's serious. He wants to talk to Samuel. Again, don't know if she's suspicious at this point about Saul's identity or not. And see, it just runs so quickly that I'm thinking, wow, doesn't, did she have to do some type of incantations or what, what did she do? But in verse 12, it immediately goes, and the woman saw Samuel. And what does she do? She cries out with a loud voice. And she says to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Now, so apparently at this point, whether she suspected or not, apparently at this point she realizes this is Saul. And I'm not sure exactly why that flip was switched. Certainly to me, it would be suspicious. Again, asking for Samuel, that's who you want to communicate with? That's pretty serious. So she cries out with a loud voice. I think that's important. And why do I think that's important? It's for this reason. I think this woman was a fraud, okay? Now, I recognize in Scripture we have cases of, spirits, demons. In the New Testament, we have, during Jesus' time, demon possession. But by and large, my opinion is those things are very limited into very limited, narrow scope or points in time when God allowed that to happen, my opinion. I think this woman was a fraud. I don't think she was able to speak to dead people. That's my opinion. I don't believe it. Now, I think she's shocked because even she's surprised that here is Samuel before her coming up. Whatever she was going through, whatever incantations, spells, whatever she was doing, Samuel is now before her. And I think she is shocked. Either my belief is that she was a fraud and, she was used to doing parlor tricks with her, patrons, and she could, pretty much how people do this kind of stuff today, right? Or potentially, maybe she could communicate with maybe evil spirits. And maybe there was an evil demonic spirit that, she was able to communicate during these seances or these sessions that would help kind of, play the part of the person that her client maybe was wanting to speak to. I'm not sure. Personally, I just don't believe that she could speak to the dead. So I think that's why she's shocked. She can't believe this is happening either. So Saul tries to reassure her, don't be afraid. What do you see? So apparently Saul can't see Samuel at this point. Only the woman can, from what I can tell, reading this. And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth, which is to me a little bit of an odd expression. And, some commentators I read say that, maybe this woman was a pagan. And for her, seeing this spirit, which she probably did not expect to see, now rising up, she kind of naturally thought that was one of the gods in her religion, her, pagan religion, whatever it might be. So she uses that expression, I see a God coming up out of the earth. Again, Saul apparently can't see Samuel, so he says, well, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel. Now, I want to pause there for a minute, because I find this, to me, this is somewhat amusing. You might not find it amusing, that's fine. But when Saul asked for the appearance, what's the description? An old man is coming up wrapped in a robe, and Saul knew it was Samuel. I thought, an old man in a robe, that seemed like it could apply to a lot of people. But apparently something about that was enough that Saul knew that this is it. Samuel is really before this woman, even though at this point he can't see it. I find that, again, I just find that a little bit humorous, that why that was a big, an old man in a robe was a tip that Saul knew immediately that, oh yeah, this is it. All right, so then he bows down with his face to the ground to pay homage. And when I read that, I thought, Saul had plenty of opportunities in his reign as king to honor Samuel. They apparently had been, what's the right word? For probably about 10 years or more, and we're going to see this verse in a minute, Saul and Samuel had been estranged. That's the word I was looking for, estranged. Samuel hadn't really spoken to Saul during that 10-year period of time. And now Saul is so desperate. Again, I think it goes back to showing his mental state at this time, that he's bowing down to pay homage to Samuel. And I just find that a little bit ironic that I think, well, you know what, Saul? You really didn't pay respect to Samuel when he was alive, so why are you doing it now? Well, it's because he's desperate. He's afraid. He sees the Philistines arrayed against him in their might, and he is worried this is not going to go well. So now at this point, there's a switch. I don't know that Saul ever sees Samuel, but he can definitely hear him, because at this point, Samuel starts communicating. He says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me for bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I'm in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore, I have summoned you to tell what I should do." So Saul tells Samuel, "Look, I'm afraid, the Philistines are against me. I'm in distress. God's not answering me, and I need to know what to do." And again, to me, there's some irony here in that Saul should know what to do. Now, I understand Saul's probably specifically talking about what he needs to do in battle against the Philistines here, but think of it a little bit more holistically. Samuel, and even before him, Joshua, Moses, was very clear to the Israelites, including Saul and the kings, that if they wanted to continue to have God's favor, they needed to be obedient and do his will, follow his law, right? So in some respect, I think to myself, Saul, you know what you should be doing. Now, you didn't do it, and now you're about to pay the price for it. But what's the point of calling back Samuel? What do you think he's going to tell you?
It's interesting, though, because Saul still understands that God is the source of the information. But when God doesn't answer him through all the various proper ways, he goes an improper way to still get the proper answer.
Right, yeah. And I think, again, that kind of to me shows that Saul has a lot of character flaws, right? And one of them is he's willing to do whatever he thinks he needs to do for his own purposes, not for God's purposes, not to follow God's law, but he's going to do whatever it is that helps him, right? And I think that illustrates that. So Samuel answers. Again, so why do you ask me? I think it's a natural response for Samuel. Since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy, the Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. And he tells exactly why. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. So let's go back, chapter 15, and see exactly what Samuel had told Saul then. So if you remember kind of setting up this story, this is where God had commanded Saul to go out against the Amalekites, completely wipe them out. And what does Saul do? Well, he kind of does a half-hearted job of it, right? They spare the king. They bring him back. He lets the men take some of the choice animals and kind of the spoils of war, so to speak. And then when Samuel confronts him, he basically denies it and says, "No, I did everything I was supposed to." And Samuel has that great line of, "Well, what's this bleating I hear?" He hears the sheep that have been captured from the Amalekites. So Samuel pronounces the judgment that God is giving, right? This is back in 1 Samuel 15. Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination," which I think that's interesting. I think I'm the one that taught this lesson a few weeks ago in this chapter. I didn't really think about that word, the sin of divination, right? So divination is trying to foretell the future. So I don't know, this is a little bit of maybe foreshadowing here, right? About what we're reading about now with Saul consulting with this medium at Endor. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So this is probably at least 10 years in the past from the events we're reading about today. So that's what I was saying. Saul, it's like, Saul, why? What do you expect Samuel is going to tell you? The last time you spoke to him, that we know about that you spoke to him, Samuel said exactly what was going to happen to you. And it's just going to get worse for Saul. So let's go look at verse 19. Moreover, this is Samuel telling Saul what's going to happen. The Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines. So I know Saul came here to try to get some type of information around what he should do against the Philistines. And I kind of think to myself, the old saying or the old adage about, be careful what you ask for. So Saul now confronts this medium. The medium calls back Samuel. Samuel now is saying, hey, look, I don't know what you're calling me for. God rejected you a long time ago. Oh, and by the way, this time tomorrow, you and your sons are going to be dead and with me here. That's a little heavy, right? I don't know what. Well, we're going to see. Might as well just go ahead and read it. Saul's response, verse 20. Then Saul fell at once, full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and night. So apparently Saul had been fasting. And I read somewhere online that sometimes that was maybe a standard practice. Sometimes if somebody was going to try to consult with the dead, like a seance or whatever, that they would fast. So had Saul been fasting specific for that reason, or maybe he was just fasting because he was so upset? But regardless, Saul is just completely, at this point, shocked, right? And just falls down on the ground, filled with fear, because Samuel says, it's not going to end well for Israel, and you and your sons are going to be dead by tomorrow. And I think to myself, if it was me, I would rather not have that information. I would rather go to battle if I was Saul. I'd rather be able to go to battle not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing that I'm going to be dead for sure the next day. But for Saul, that's not the option. He's told specifically, you and your sons are going to be dead. And that came as a complete shock to him. I'm going to skip the remainder of the verses in chapter 28, but basically what happens is the medium, I guess her motherly instincts kind of kick in, and she tells Saul, hey, look, you got to eat. She prepares this meal for him. It takes a lot of coaxing, but eventually her and Saul's men are able to get Saul to have some type of substance. And then you just have this sad kind of ending of Saul and his men going off in the night, basically to await his doom. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right into that in chapter 31. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul, just as Samuel had told him the night before. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded. So I kind of take it by this that maybe as they're kind of, Saul and his little group, his sons, when they're fleeing, his sons fall first. Saul is somehow able to keep fleeing, but eventually the Philistine archers maybe see him kind of maybe not even knowing who it was, but they see this soldier, Israelite soldier, and they're able to, maybe at some distance, is to kind of start picking him off, hit him with some arrows, and then wound him. Verse 4, then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. So Saul knows the gig is up, right? This is it. His sons are dead. The archers have wounded him. There's no escape. He's afraid, rightfully so, now of what's going to happen to him if the Philistines take him alive. War's cruel at any time in history, but especially back then. You think about what they would do to Saul if they caught him alive, right? It's not going to be pretty. You're going to be tortured. You're going to be probably marched around through the cities in Philistia, and, who knows what's going to happen, mocked. And then eventually you're going to be killed, if you're lucky, unless they keep you alive and just continue to torture you. So Saul, rightfully so, I think, is afraid of what's going to happen next, and he wants no part of it. So he asked the armor bearer to kill him. And the armor bearer, we see, the armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his sword, his own sword, and fell upon it. And the armor bearer, I got to think that, was he unwilling to kill Saul because of Saul being the king, similar to what David, would always talk about Saul being God's anointed and would do no harm to Saul, even if when he had those two opportunities that we've read about previously this quarter. So was the armor bearer kind of in that mindset? Or maybe, I almost think this armor bearer at this point is so just out of it, knowing what's in store for not just Saul, but for himself, that he's probably just in, some type of panic mode at this point and probably can't even, think clearly. So he won't kill Saul. So Saul takes his sword and falls upon it. So a little bit of bonus information. If we were to skip over to 2 Samuel chapter 1, when David finds out about Saul's death, and I'm kind of bringing this up just to kind of give you just kind of as something to maybe think about, right, is that the story's a little bit different. You have this, if I remember right, you have this Amalekite soldier or person who claims, comes to David, and claims that, he was there, he came across Saul, that Saul was leaning upon his sword, and that he asked this Amalekite to kill him, which he apparently gladly did. And, oh, by the way, here's Saul, I think the crown and whatever. And David immediately says, you raised your hand against God's anointed? Well, guess what, buddy? You're dead. And they kill him. And sometimes people will say, well, there's a little bit of a contradiction in these accounts. And I don't think there is. I think probably what happened in 2 Samuel chapter 1 is this Amalekite soldier is probably trying to ingratiate himself to David and claiming that he saw Saul and that, oh, by the way, he killed Saul, basically for David because he knew Saul was always after David, right? And David saw through that completely and said, yeah, no, I'm not buying that. You're done. You're out of here. So anyway, a little bit of a different take on the events, but I don't think there's any real contradiction. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. And Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, all of his men on the same day together. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw the men of Israel had fled, that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. And they put his armor in the temple of Asheroth and they fastened the body to the wall of Bethshan. So pretty brutal. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Now, this is an interesting story because if you go back, this is really, I think, probably the first part of Saul's kingship is the people in Jabesh Gilead are surrounded, needing help, and Saul comes to their rescue. That was many years before. But obviously it made a big enough impact in their life that when they heard about what had happened to Saul, they rose and went to go get the body of Saul and his sons, which is a very, very brave, heroic thing to do. Well, that's not going to look that well. So I looked up, when I was looking at Mount Gilboa, and I saw some pictures, and you're not going to be able to see, unfortunately, the headings on some of this. But this is one of the pictures that somebody had put together and kind of labeled the different parts. And so to me, it's a beautiful area. But what we have here is possibly, this would be the Jezreel Valley, flat area right here, right? This ridge along here is Mount Gilboa. This is looking off, I believe, to the west, so out towards the sea, and this will be back towards the east. So the Israelites were potentially camped here. The Philistines were encamped here in Shunem, and they had this battle in the Jezreel Valley. You can see Endor is labeled somewhere right over here. So you can kind of see how Saul, when he visited the witch of Endor, he would have had to potentially moved along this route, potentially close to the Philistines. But apparently, when the battle is lost, Saul and his sons are able to somehow come up here on Gilboa, and they somebody, obviously they don't know where Saul died, but they have this here labeled potentially where Saul and his sons were dead. So they were up on this hill, this ridge line above the Jezreel Valley. So wrapping this up, I know we're out of time. One of the things I thought about is, in the life of Saul, is there a point of no return? And what that might mean to us. There's probably not going to be enough time to really do this justice. But, the die was cast against Saul years before this. God said, I'm taking the kingdom away and I'm going to pass it on to David, somebody that's going to obey me. So in some respects, the die is cast. There is no return. There is no point of there's no returning to Saul. He's not going to get that kingdom back, right? The die is cast. Now, there's a difference though between losing your soul and losing the throne. Saul had lost the throne, but I truly believe that if Saul had obeyed God and turned back to God, his ending would have somehow been different. It wouldn't have meant that his kingdom was going to carry on. We know that was God already said that's not going to happen. But maybe his ending wouldn't have been this brutal, just sad, tragic. Sin has far-reaching consequences. Saul was the one that sinned. But I think all of us know we have free will. And with free will, we can do good or we can do evil. And the unfortunate reality is, when people decide to sin and do evil, a lot of times it doesn't just impact them. There's a lot of collateral damage. And we see that here. Saul is the one responsible. But think about, to me, the biggest tragedy is Saul's tragic. He's a tragic character. But to me, the biggest tragedy in all of this is Jonathan. Jonathan was God-fearing. He obeyed God. He loved David. He loses his life because of the sin of his father. Obviously, disobedience leads to downfall. I think, if you want to sum up Saul's life, to me, that's it. He disobeyed, and God was done with him. few other little quick things, and then we're going to wrap up here, is that, without God, I think we can all kind of fall into the state potentially of despair. We see that with Saul because of his own actions. And then even in sometimes the darkest moments and the tragedy that we see here, there can still exist good and courageous acts. Specifically, I'm talking about the men of Jabesh Gilead who went, risked their own lives in order to recover the body of Saul and his sons, whether that was just completely in respect to what Saul had done for them earlier, whether it was just because Saul was the king and respecting that position, they felt they needed to go and get the bodies back away from the Philistines. Either way. Okay, that's it for me this quarter. Like I said, next week, Mike's going to be going through, I believe, a review of 1 Samuel and the things that we've talked about. So I hope to see you all next week.